him in under Trudeau, which he can absolutely do. He can name Carney in that position. And then if there's some sort of a crisis, then they bring Carney up.
Carney's been telling Trudeau what to do this whole time. Yeah. And we're seeing the destruction of our country. Chrystia Freeland admittedly has been taking advice from him. So people think he's a smart guy. Well, he's been helping them to destroy not only our freedoms, but our economy.
You know, he's an excellent distraction while those behind the BIS-UN get the rest of their plans perfected. And whether that's by 2025, 2026, or 2024, I'm not sure. But when you read all of the Fourth Industrial Revolutions, the Great Resets, all of the books that they have put out there, 2025 is the date that keeps coming up. The UN agreements, it's all 2025. All of their books talk about the tipping point of being 2025. And I don't believe Trudeau is going to remain prime minister. I think Carney is going to be the one that ends up overlooking all of North America.
They're doing it at the same time, but it looks like they're ready to install something else.
And as people get poorer and poorer and poorer, everyone's mad to the point where no one's going to vote for Trudeau. So I think they're seeing that like the mind screw isn't working. If you guys think Carney's going to save the country, he's been the one giving advice to Trudeau and Freeland.
Correct.
Carney, what we see as the biggest threat to both our countries right now is the marriage of climate change and banking.
Yes.
And so we don't believe that social credit scores and carbon credit scores and your digital ID and your CBDCs, we don't think they'll be separate things. They will be all one package put together. And I think your carbon and social credit scores are going to be all one thing. Like they did with COVID, they're going to do this with climate change. Oh, you drive a big truck. Well, you are a danger to society now. But they're also looking at risk management with banking institutions. So OSFI, Superintendent of Financial Institutions, they just recently did this false science study working with banks to do risk management, i.e., insurance companies. What is your risk with northern Alberta with all the fires that could happen? And so they have to do this risk assessment. And you're going to find that banks will no longer fund you if you're a trucking company and you have all these diesel burning trucks. Now your trucks are devalued. For example, same thing with houses. You have to get your house up to code now. Otherwise, it's no good. It gets devalued. You can't sell it. You can't afford to put more on your mortgage to upgrade your house. That's the biggest way they're going to come at our money, and they're going to take us out with that. Carney is the architect of all of that stuff, and that's why he's a danger. He manufactured the problem. In 2008, we had a global crisis. He manufactured the problem, and then he also was the architect of the solution that came out of that problem. It was all about the 2008 crunch, and a lot of it was betting on shorts. So there were companies out there giving A+ credit ratings to these mortgage investments. And so basically they would take a bunch of mortgages and lump them together. And yeah, one or two of them might fail, but they won't all fail. So they gave it a A+ credit rating. But at the same time, they shorted it. They bet against them. They bet them to fail.
And this is why so many people ended up claiming bankruptcy or just walking away from their houses because they couldn't do it. And the mortgage packages were packaging in those mortgages in with only one or two, but when they were selling the packages, it was, hey, we're going to have like 10 A+ mortgages, 2B, 2C, 2D. So it looked like it was a nice diversified portfolio. They were selling so many because of all these bonuses that they were being paid that the SEC kind of stopped looking at what they were doing. And then, of course, you had the big market crash.
Right.
These banks are now having to turn them down. And with the addition of the Basel IV that came into effect this year and became mandatory, it was no longer voluntary. Now you attach the climate change asset to that. And if you have natural gas heating and natural gas dryer and a natural gas stove, all of a sudden your $1 million home is devalued because those have now been devalued due to the carbon credit scoring. So now your bank that thought your house was worth $1 million is now saying it's only worth $750. But now because real estate is even reduced further and the interest rates have gone up, your house is really only worth $500,000. So now people can't finance their homes unless they do a full-on renovation in your home. And the real estate market, the realtors were lobbying the government several years ago. I remember sitting in Kim Rudd's office, who was our MP in Ottawa, lobbying against this because the government's been trying to bring this in for many, many years now and saying if you use a realtor to sell your home, you must retrofit your home to meet the standards. And several years ago, before COVID, we actually managed to lobby that out. But here they are bringing it back again, but they're bringing it back in now at the bank level, not at the housing level. So instead of using realtors to push it because it didn't work, they're now using the banks to push the same scenarios.
They were given an A+ rating and shouldn't have. And Goldman Sachs was heavily involved in all that. And it turns out a couple of years later, you find out Goldman Sachs out of that somehow plundered a bunch of the US gold reserves. Goldman Sachs walked away like kings out of that. Mark Carney was there.
Yes.
We've gotten way off book with banks. So they introduced Basel, which was kind of floating around, but then they said, you know, we're going to go to this Basel system. And they did that then, and it's taken on 4 iterations now. We're up to Basel 4. And the person who helped architect that and bring that in was a BIS, Bank of International Settlements, IMF, International Monetary Fund. They got together in Geneva and actually Basel. And came up with this new system. And Mark Carney was in the middle of all of that. So he was helped foster the problem, and then he helped become the architect of the solution. Since then, it's taken this iteration to Basel IV where they're like, well, we need to incorporate this climate change. Well, who is in charge of the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change? Mark Carney. So he's setting global policies on climate change and banking, and his company Brookfield makes lots and lots of money off of climate change and banking.
And you guys played an excellent clip from, I love this woman, Friends of Science. Let's quickly watch it now.
Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. Mark Carney has been appointed as climate envoy to the UN. In October 2019, Carney threatened that firms ignoring the climate crisis will go bankrupt. That sounds like a coercive threat from someone who's been pushing carbon markets for decades. Carney is former governor of the Bank of England. Before that, governor of the Bank of Canada, and before that, he was with Goldman Sachs for some 13 years. In September 2015, just before the COP21 Paris Agreement, Mark Carney gave a speech to Lloyd's of London, the big insurance firm, on the tragedy of the horizon. In it, he claimed that climate change was a crisis beyond the traditional financial cycles of a few years. After Carney's speech, Steve Kopitz of Princeton Energy Advisors did a fact check on Carney's climate and disaster cost claims, only to discover Carney's speech was a failure of analysis, presenting the source data and facts. Kopitz writes, "The very worst interpretation is that Mr. Carney is in fact aware of the source data, but chose to make hysterical claims to promote a personal political agenda." Thus, it's very problematic that Mr. Carney continues to carry these false notions forward to his new position as the climate czar at the UN. At the COP25 conference in Madrid, talks fell apart over Article 6. This is a section that refers to carbon trading as a kind of Ponzi scheme that relies on you, the little people, to underwrite it with carbon taxes. She calls it the subprime carbon is coming, referring to the disastrous subprime mortgage meltdown of 2008. Unlike regular industries, carbon trading is the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. So, unlike fuel taxes that you pay, where you get a road and road maintenance in return, or income taxes, where you get money for hospital and health services, military defense, schools and education, Carbon taxes buy you nothing. They also do nothing for the climate or environment. Bjorn Lomborg, the skeptical environmentalist, has shown that even if every country met their Paris Agreement greenhouse gas reduction targets, there might be a reduction in warming of an infinitesimal 0.05 degrees Celsius by 2100. That is an immeasurable amount of change.
So here you've got a man who makes his money off of climate ESG policy, at the same time doing what? He's also the head of the UN agency that's doing what? Making climate policy. So making money off of climate policy, making climate policy. Okay.
When I was researching Carney, they've been on this whole thing for years. They're so far ahead of the game. So we've been going through their stuff, and they nailed it. Like, all of this is predicated on the idea that they've done all these studies, and from these studies they have to make these changes. And they're saying, well, Mark Carney is fudging the science. He's nothing to stand on.
Which he is. And they're even now they're telling banks and insurance companies that they have to do their risk assessments and make their risk policies based on their fourth quarter of 2023. And then they're throwing all these fake scenarios at them. And they've got to somehow come up with policy to cover those fake scenarios for the year 2025, 2026, 2027, et cetera, et cetera. But they're only allowed to use the baseline of their quarter four for 2023.
And this is exactly what they did during COVID. They had a fake, this is what we think is going to happen, destroyed our economy, destroyed our freedoms, BS'd about masks and all that to force us to take these vaccines that the government makes money off. And Carney was advising Trudeau and Freeland on that as well. I mean, I wonder if they're going to actually try to start scrubbing all that.
Yeah, from last year. And every other video that they played from that newscast is there, but this one. And we went to the Wayback Machine. We went to YouTube. And it was June of this year, or March of this year. Sorry. So that's very recent. And they've already scrubbed that.
So it's our job right now to go find every video you can right now and start downloading it. And then somebody will make a montage of it. It's so important.
And save it.
I thought there was rules, at least on paper, that a prime minister or president could not be the prime minister without getting rid of all of his conflicts of interest. How the hell will Carney be prime minister when every single decision he makes, he's making money off of the result? You make more money. He didn't even deny it. All he said was, you don't know how globalism works.
Yeah. So they've given them tens of millions of dollars under her rule while she's on the board. So they're not hiding it, and they just stopped answering the questions at that point.
Carney's in the WEF too. Do you remember what his title is there?
We've got him listed everywhere else as the chair and the co-chair and advisor, special advisor.
He's the head of the snake. Oh my gosh. We will become the new world order up here.
I think everybody needs to put eyes on how they're moving the economy forward. It really has a lot to do with climate change. And so the reason we have the carbon tax, nobody asks, like, why would a government tax us and then not want to keep any of the money of the tax? They tote that they don't get any money from it. They give it all back, which has been disproven anyway. But why would they even tax people if they're not getting anything from those taxes? You know, that's the basic question. Well, Mark Carney in his book Values, that'll tell you exactly where everything's going and exactly how they're doing it. His book Values talks about the carbon tax. They need to add value to carbon, because if they don't add value to carbon, then the green energy has no value. For example, solar energy, it only saves you money if you're saving carbon. And if there's no money attached to this air, it's just air. If they don't attach this false value to it, then these green energies don't have any value. And Brookfield has set up a lot of investments. They've got billions of dollars of investments in green energy, and that has no value unless they start attaching value to carbon. And so it's a made up thing. It's 100% made up. So that's why they're doing this carbon tax. They couldn't care less about whether or not they keep it or not. They have to have carbon value. And so because of that, now they start saying, well, green energy has value. And then they start looking at what you're doing, diesel engines or gas powered stoves.
He actually was part of a guide that he wrote, Economic Returns to Green Technology and Politicizing Returns to Green Policies. So when you start reading his values and you start reading this, and he's saying new technologies will be financed in anticipation of climate action, you know that this is happening. And we think they are done with the boiling frog scenario. They can't just bring it in piece by piece by piece, because we've caught on to that scenario. We've got caught on to that action plan. It'll be a brand spanking new system, and people are going to lose their minds.
They know the gig is up. They know half the world at least is saying this climate narrative's BS, that it's our fault. It's BS that you guys tax us into oblivion is going to change the weather, the climate change. We know the crazy amount of geoengineering they're doing. Everybody knows what's going on, but these guys aren't going to go down. So I truly agree that they're just going to be like, you know what? We don't care what the voters think of us. We're doing this.
Exactly. When all the tipping points point to 2025 and the UN has already, sectioned out all of the land in the world, I don't think there is. I think Mark Carney's their guy, and we aren't going to have a say in it. Well, the only say we'll have is if everybody rises up and says no or enough. Or does a worldwide strike of some sort. You are allotted so much tonnage of carbon that you're allowed to use. And once you're over that tonnage, you start getting fined. And it's not just the tonnage or the carbon that you use. It's the carbon that your tenants use. It's the carbon that their clients use. So it's a whole darn domino effect going all the way down. And they're doing this because at the SDG summit, we learned we didn't bite the incentives. We didn't buy into their incentives, and we are educating people on how not to buy into their incentives. So now they realize they can't necessarily start at the common folk people. Now they have to hit and lobby and change policies at the government level for the banks, because everybody depends on the banks in order to survive, in order to pay their mortgages, in order to pay their insurance. Everybody does online payments. Everybody uses their ATM or their credit cards, and everybody takes out loans and has mortgages. So the bank is the choke point.
Right. And so that's really significant, because, if the tenant's carbon or the landlord's carbon goes down by what the tenants use, then they're going to decide who they do and don't want as part of their tenancy. And then also banks do the same thing. The banks will be charged based on the investments that they invest in. So if they invest in a heavy carbon, like a high-end diesel trucking company, that's going to affect their carbon credit score. So they're not going to invest in those anymore. And that's the thing that's coming forward right now. And he drops a breadcrumb in the COP, the COP26 and the COP28 interviews. He starts dropping those breadcrumbs that banks are going to have to report every year on their carbon use.
Yeah. And when they said you will own nothing and you will be happy, they meant it. And so many people said, that's impossible. I own my house. How are they going to take away my house? This is how they're going to do it. So the best thing you can do is get yourself out of debt, because if you are indebted to the bank in any way, shape, or form, you are going to have massive renovation bills to come through in order to secure your mortgage when it comes up for renewal. And if you can't renew your mortgage and no buyer is willing to buy your house out for what you owe on your mortgage, because now your carbon negativity score is going to attract to them, then you're in big trouble. You're going to end up losing your home, and you're still going to owe on it. I used to do collections way back in my early years for CMHC, and so many people lost their homes. And yet, because the banks didn't get what they owed on their mortgage, they still owed that mortgage on their home now to CMHC. So they didn't have a house, but they still owed money. And that I can see happening in the next few years because of this carbon scheme.
Right. And it's not a future scenario. This is Basel 4 right now, BASEL, Roman numerals 4. Basel 4 talks about all of this stuff right now.
I interviewed her before she passed away, behind the green mask or behind the green veil. She was telling us, starting like 20 years ago, they're not just going to come in with a SWAT team and take your house, like in a communism movie from the 60s.
Right.
They will literally almost bankrupt you into giving up your house. And she said, when they start to do this climate stuff, and this is why they're fear porning everyone.
Yeah.
And I don't want to forget how important it is that people start following Friends of Science and see everything that Carney's said. Friends of Science is showing scientifically what a fraud it is that he's saying. So
exactly right.
Please go follow there. So if it's not about climate change, what's it about? But she said, Odessa, what they're going to do is it'll start costing you so much to keep your house. You can't. And one thing they're going to do is they're going to flip a switch and say, if you want to sell your house or renovate your house or keep your house, you have to bring it up to the green code.
Yes,
exactly.
Or climate change. And you won't be able to, because by that time, inflation will be so bad, you can't even afford beef, chicken, and cheese. It's a luxury, beef, chicken, and cheese. And, you know, among other things, and your taxes are going to go up. So people that actually own their own home, but have a mortgage, now they're doing all these taxes where people are like, forget it, I'm just going to sell it. Right. Yeah. And we all become renters. Although right now in Vancouver, there's no point in selling to have money because rent is 3 times the amount. But did you guys know there's a lobby group? I can't remember their name, but I watched, I wanted to cringe. There's a lobby group and they're quite proud of themselves. And it's a bunch of kind of commercial drive, Birkenstock wearing, green haired, you know, know-it-alls. And they've brought Jagmeet Singh on, leader of the Green Party, as well as Trudeau. They are proud of themselves that this lobby group has gotten so strong, and it's young people because they're taught in university that they're victims and they're taught Marxism and that everything's like the old person with a mansion's fault.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
They are pressuring the Liberal government to make homeowners pay a fee every year to keep their house. This isn't what a property tax. We've already got that. They, in the same breath, talk about how it's so expensive to have a house in Vancouver, Toronto. They know that $1 million home in Toronto is a tear-down, rat-infested, 3-bedroom dump from the 30s.
Yes.
Okay? You own a home that's worth $1 million, like it's nothing. Right now, that's an apartment, okay? Yeah. They want to then tax parents who have maybe 2 or 3 kids shoved in there, already paying exorbitant tax. Yeah. Their grown kids are already taking up a room there because they can't afford rent anymore. So now you've become the provider in this small house for grown kids, little kids, taxed to the hills. They want to call you wealthy if you own $1 million home, whether you've paid it off or not.
Yeah.
And now make you pay to keep your house. It's like 20 grand, I believe, at 1% a year to hold on to that house. Poof, gone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, it hasn't happened, but they're heavily lobbying. And Trudeau has no problem coming onto their show and talking about it.
Yeah. Well, not only that, the last consensus in comparison to the previous consensus that they filled out, but this last consensus that they sent out, it went so far as asking how many bathrooms are in your house, which has never been on a consensus before. It's not even part of a consensus. But how many bedrooms, how many people live in your house, how many bedrooms are empty. There was a reason why they did that. And it was for this very reason. They can tax you on vacancy rooms. They can tax you if you don't put extra people in it. And then there's overwhelming housing crisis. They can now, I'm sure they're looking at legislation to force you to fill those bedrooms for people who currently don't have a home. And we know that they put out the pleas asking you to open up your doors to refugees and immigrants coming in.
Right.
So we know that that was one of the things behind that new consensus. And so many people filled it out, not thinking anything of it.
They'll stop doing it. They'll stop encouraging it.
Yeah, we figure it'll be a very short period of time once this information gets out before they put a stop to it.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's all about money. It's not actually about human rights.
Correct.
Right.
But not only that, we know that the banks are the choke point, and the banks have been reporting on our spending habits. And so we have taught the algorithms or taught the AI how we shop, how we behave, what's important to us, what's not important to us. So once they have that information, they very easily can choke you out.
Right.
So the less information they have on you, the better.
Right. Right.
So I think we worked it out that there's like 254 transactions before that $100 is worth zero.
Now, the World Economic Forum has said that they're using banks to do the digital ID and the CBDCs because banks have the infrastructure and the knowledge and the know-how. So the banks are actually funding your war against you, and you're giving them that money, and you're giving the government that money to fund that war against you. And we need to start doing that. So this is really the biggest solution we've got.
Yeah.
And it's non-confrontational, it's non-combative, and it's very effective because once we start saying no more money for you guys, they're gonna freak out like crack addicts.
Exactly.
Without a dealer.
Stop it. Because at the end of the day, that money doesn't stay here. And eventually you're going to be the business that closes because nobody that lives here can afford to shop there because you gave away those jobs for those incentives. Stop buying into the incentives. They're not worth it at the end of the day. Every time you trade something for an incentive, you've actually traded away your privacy. You've traded away another Canadian job. And if you're a parent who have children, you just blew any chance of them having a Canada with a really great growing economy. Something else that's important too. In 2016, Trudeau brought in the legislation of bail-ins for the banks. The moment you put a single dollar, a single penny into the bank, it is no longer your money.
Right.
It belongs to the bank. And when the banks start going bankrupt, and we know that, 10 years ago, there was 8,200 and change banks in the US. As of today, there's less than 4,100 banks remaining because they keep claiming bankruptcy because of all these new rules, the Basel IVs that have come in. And now with OSFI pushing and mandating the Basel IV and the climate incentives behind that, we're going to see more and more banks going bankrupt. And when they go bankrupt, it's not the federal government with your tax dollars bailing them out. It'll be your funds that are in the bank bailing them out. And I know I hear all the time, oh, it's okay because we have the CDIC who's going to insure my money up to $100,000. Well, where do you think the CDIC keeps their money? In a bank.
Right.
So if their bank has gone down, they're now bankrupt. So where are you getting this insurance for your funds? The moment you put it in, it belongs to the bank. And when they go down, because of Basel IV is saying that they now have to have a certain percentage of assets to back up their credit ledgers. And when they don't, they now fold. They get to take your money with them. And you are SOL.
And we have to remember that it's Mark Carney selling the climate change catastrophe to get everybody, including the banks and all of us, to have to do all this stuff. And like the author of Behind the Green Mask said, it is just so that the elite can take back control of every single person, animal, and asset, like in the olden days with the kingdom where we're the serfs.
Correct.
Exactly. And people say, well, they can't enforce that, but they're going to, through social and carbon credit scoring, when my credit score, my carbon credit score affects your carbon credit score, then we're going to be policing each other. And we saw that all the time with COVID. So that's absolutely, they can enforce it through.
We already are communist here. We're already telling on each other. Yeah.
And we got to just stop caring. We just got to, like, you know what? Hey, lefties, we gave you the keys to the car and you drove it into the lake. So now it's time we took back control because enough is enough. We got to get back to normalcy here. So no more Marxism. And we don't do the Marxism, communism, fascism thing. Remember, it's all globalism and they just play whatever card they want as they need them.
Well, yeah, they just use the techniques of that.
Exactly. Correct. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That goes to show you how powerful and important this man is, because normally you can say anything about anybody running and it's not a big deal, and they just take off the vaccine stuff. Now they don't want anybody knowing about who Mark Carney is. And the fact that he can snap his fingers and your show is gone just goes to show, like, he is the snake.
Correct.
Yeah. Didn't help that we titled the show Globalist Mark Carney. I think that was a bit of a red flag for those
But you think he would have been proud of that, because he is a globalist and he's on all the global think tanks.
Did you know if the banks do a bail-in, they can take the contents in your bank vault? But storing your gold and silver at home could be a huge security risk. Every day, our dollar is worth less and less. Inflation is stealing the only savings families have. Now more than ever, it's so important to hedge the savings you've worked so hard for. Banks have been failing all over the world, and social credit has all but arrived. But did you know you can do wholesale price vaulting and retail delivery from the most prestigious, reliable company in Canada? Did you also know if you decide to leave Canada, your gold and silver can be sent right to you after you arrive to your destination? The only company I personally use and trust are those awake guys at New World Precious Metals. Take control of your family's future. You can just click the link in my show description or type in the web address libertytalkcanada.ca/gold to get on their mailing list, attend their webinar, or book an appointment. Let them know Odessa sent you.